Okay, a perfect time to start, 10:03. I want to thank everyone for joining us here for this webinar, The Hidden Cost of Food. All right, so my name is Bobby Boyd. I'm the Equity Program Manager for the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's presentation of the forum. For those that are not familiar with our organization, the forum is a collaboration of businesses and institutions dedicated to promoting practices that advance climate leadership, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy. We host events and programs throughout the state, including this monthly Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. This webinar is sponsored by Shupan with some additional support from Foresight Management. Now, for our next event, for the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, it will be at the Great Lakes Bay. We'll be hosting a sustainability happy hour on February 22nd at 3 p.m. at the Oracle Brewing in Saginaw. So if you're in that area, we'd love to have you out and you're gonna have a brief conversation while we're there. More details about this event will be found at our website, which is at MiSB as in boy, F as in Frank.org. Next webinar for the forum will be on March 2nd at 11 a.m. and it will focus on green labs, featuring my Green Lab CEO, James Connolly. And you can sign up and get more information about this event and sign up on our website. And you can also send information in regards to wanting to be a part of that webinar in the chat function. Please do consider becoming a member of our forum. If you're already a corporate or institutional member of one of our regional programs, a professional MiSBF membership is complimentary if you're already part of our regional programs. If not, you can become a professional member today for only $50. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker in regards to our webinar series, The Hidden Cost of Food. Our first speaker will be Teresa Hendricks. I do want to share with everyone as well before we start that you can share your thoughts and questions with our panelists and all the attendees through the chat function over here at the bottom of your screen. And we will also have time at the end of this presentation for open questions and answers. So like I said, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Teresa Hendricks. She's a director and senior litigator for Migrant Legal Aid. Throughout her career, Teresa has represented numerous victims of labor abuse and trafficking and has litigated class and collective employment actions for migrant workers in Michigan. She began the Fair Food Project of Migrant Legal Aid after getting a call from a retailer asking for a heads up if she found systemic exploitation among migrant farm workers. So Teresa, thank you for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Bobby. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for listening. I'm really excited to talk about this. This career of mine has started, I was born in Grand Rapids, and I lived in Spain for a short period, and I knew I wanted to do social justice. And when I found myself in Spain, suddenly homeless and penniless, I knew that I wanted to come back to the States, finish law school, and then do service for people whose language was other than English as their primary language. And luckily, Migrant Legal Aid, formerly a longer name, was in Michigan, and it was a perfect fit. So here we are 30 years later, and I'm still enjoying the honor of representing our Michigan farm workers. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the Fair Food Project of Migrant Legal Aid, and to give you some background on our migrant farm workers in Michigan. A lot of this I didn't know when I began, and as things change over the years, new things come up, and so I'm excited to talk about this. And our second slide talks about our mission, and our mission is to protect the dignity, health, and livelihood of migrant farm workers. And I'm going to tell you what each one of those things means for us: dignity, health, and livelihood. But you can see from the picture that we do outreach to the migrant housing locations. And in the old days, when I started, we called them camps. And so if you hear me say migrant camp, I mean to say migrant housing site. And in slide 3, you can see an example of what we do. We pass out information to try to start conversations with farm workers. They're usually vulnerable for a number of reasons that we're going to discuss. But every year law can change and things can come up, new schemes or pay tricks can happen, and we want to keep them informed and educated so that they can empower themselves to defend their rights. The agency that I work for is turning 50 this year. So it will have a big celebration, and what we do is basically law cases in state and federal court and in administrative proceedings. But we also have learned how to resolve disputes through our Fair Food program, and that's what we're going to learn about today. Those are nice because they're out of court. So everything that I've trained for and all the class actions or collective actions that we have as a remedy doesn't have to be the only remedy, and we can offer our clients and members of the Fair Food program another solution outside of court. So in this slide, you'll see where we talk about health, dignity, and livelihood. And under health, the things that we help with are overexposure to pesticides. Increasing temperatures and climate change in Michigan is causing a lot of concern among our farm workers, including a case involving death in one of our clients. We've had issues with long-term exposure to pesticides resulting in cancer and a number of injuries and illnesses that are common among the farm worker population. Under dignity, we've seen inhumane conditions, different kinds of trafficking. I call them the old school and the new school form of trafficking. And we've seen an increase in hate and discriminatory and assaultive conduct and anti-immigrant sentiment toward our workers in the last few years. And under dignity, I also put our housing because we have to license most of our migrant housing, and it has to be habitable and it should be free from infestations and dangerous conditions. And field sanitation is under dignity as well, because that includes things like when you're working out in the field for hours, you need to have a porta potty handy, and that porta potty has to be serviced so it's actually usable, and it's got to be within a certain distance from where you're working. And so many times we see that that just isn't the case. It also has to do with drinking water, making sure that they're being provided fresh drinking water and single-use drinking cups. All of those things go under treating our workers humanely and keeping their sense of dignity about them. And then livelihood, that's where a lot of the lawsuits come from, is when you're just stealing wages, or there's an intermediary labor broker or crew leader and they're shorting wages, or you're exploiting them in other ways, like you've got a trick with the scale that's weighing things, or your bucket has changed and you're paying by the bucket or piece rate. Or if you're promising one thing under a contract and then completely doing this bait and switch and not offering them what you told them that you would offer them in their employment. So that's the scope of my 50 years of what I've been helping with, or 30 years of what we've been helping with. So on farm workers, let's look at slide 5 and look at the types of crops that show that are touched by the hands of a migrant worker. And you see everything from apples to Christmas trees to tomatoes. We are huge producers of apples, blueberries, cherries in the country. And so we bring in a lot of income to Michigan because of our hand touch crops. And I like to say it's hard to have a meal or think of something on your plate that hasn't touched the hands of a migrant worker first. And that's how close they are to our everyday lives, but we might not realize it. In slide number 6, to give you an idea of the scope, under housing sites, or what we used to call camps, we have about 1,000 sites in Michigan, probably about 4,000 units. That changes as things get built or destroyed. And then that has capacity for about 23,000 people. And you'll hear more about the population from Ruben Martinez, our second speaker, and a lot of those statistics. But when we look at the produce that they're touching, we have about 47,000 farms in Michigan, and there are 45 crops on which farm workers work. And we know from old figures from the state of Michigan that they have a market value of around $11 billion. So they are important not only to what we eat, but they're important to our economy. And the slide 8 talks about, is it slide 7? Slide 7 talks about our farm worker demographics. Because when I started, we've been representing undocumented workers since the beginning, and they're about 50% of them are undocumented. But there's a wide gamut of farm workers. You can have people that are indigenous from Guatemala or Mexico, and you might have your traditional domestic Mexican-American farm workers. And occasionally you might get H-2A workers from Jamaica or another country. But we're seeing an increase in what we call H-2A workers because they're contracted under a special visa for temporary work. And we'll talk about how those exploitations occur with those types of workers. Most of them speak Spanish. Most of them have about an 8th grade education. And you can see from these stats that Michigan farms have about 70,000 jobs. And we know that their income for a family of 4, in my experience, is usually about $20,000 or less. And while they're in Michigan, they're trying to earn the bulk of their income for the year. So let's look at their vulnerabilities in slide 8. And you can probably imagine some of them, but language barriers are one, and I'm going to tell you all the different languages that we might encounter. There is a fear of people in authority, and our workers tend to think that if one officer in one town stops them, they might be connected with immigration, who might be connected with another entity, who might be connected with the courts. And so there's a lot of fear of people who could at any time have the families separated or deported, or they could be retaliated against if one of them complains, and then they get a blacklist among the growers. And we do what we can to protect against retaliation, but that fear is an innate thing within the population. There are cultural differences, and a lot of times their contracts will not even be in writing. So they might have lack of employment details or the terms, and unless they've been coming to the farm year after year and kind of know the routine, they might not know all of the conditions of their employment, or there might be some that come up that they weren't expecting, or some that change. And when I see workers coming to the same farm year after year, it's a sign to me that that farm is doing something right, that the workers appreciate the work. But there are times and places where there are crew leaders who are very unscrupulous, and there is a high turnover of workers at that location. And so that's a red flag to us, that there's something drastically wrong going on at that farm employer. The workers may not be familiar with the legal protections. Imagine they're traveling through different states, and every state has different laws, different workers' compensation laws, different speed laws for the traffic, different driver's license rules. And so it's important that we have constant contact with them to make sure that they know their rights and responsibilities while they're in Michigan. A lot of times they will be brought somewhere or follow someone to a specific location, and they might not have a good orientation about where exactly they are. And there might not even be a specific address for where they're working. And then on top of that, there are certain diseases and conditions that will tend to affect a farm worker population quicker than a traditional workforce, because they're very densely housed and they work very closely together. So let's look at the slide 9 and look at the language barrier that I talked about. People sometimes think migrant workers only speak Spanish as their first language. Many of them are fluent in English if they were born here, but the majority seem to be more comfortable and prefer to speak in Spanish. But there are many indigenous languages that we see. And so I have to detect an accent in their Spanish when they speak to me to know that they are indigenous speakers. And then I'll ask them in what their mother tongue is so that I know, and I can gauge if they need a better interpreter in their own mother tongue, or if Spanish is going to be good enough for me to communicate with them and our staff to communicate with them. So, but we have access to translators and many former clients in most of the indigenous languages that we encounter in our area in Michigan. And they're from Guatemala has 3 or 4 of those, and from Mexico we have 3 or 4 of them that we commonly see. So let's talk about what I said about fear of people in power, and that's on slide 10. And this is where the law enforcement is meant to be protective of the workers, because they're often the victims of crime or exploitation or abuse, and they might not trust law enforcement. And so part of our dignity effort is a program we have called Defending Against Hate. And so we have intervened in cases where we teach the farm workers which law enforcement are safe to communicate with and how to explain their victimization. And then we also do seminars to the law enforcement to try to help them improve cultural competency when dealing with farm workers. And it deals with some of the things that we're talking about today. And then judicial staff, I've done trainings with them as well, because there's a traditionally different way of answering a direct question depending on what culture you're from. And it might seem rude to answer a question either yes or no without giving background if you're from a farm worker community. And so sometimes we just explain that to judicial staff so they understand why somebody might not answer simply yes or no, or might want to give this full background. So that's important too for healthcare workers. And so we've presented cultural competency training also to healthcare workers and emergency room doctors. But lack of employment details is part of the vulnerabilities. And so on slide 11, I'm talking about lack of employment details in this sense. So if you are an H-2A worker and you're coming here from another country, you have to have a contract that the government approved that lays out all of the terms and conditions of your employment. And we're getting close to 40,000 H-2A workers in Michigan, I think. They might get here and the labor broker is the technical farm employer, and they will farm the workers out to other traditional farms. So this is kind of like a temp service. Think of it as a temp service, placing workers at different farms. But that person placing them is the employer, and they have total control over transportation, pay, housing conditions, working conditions, hours, communication, everything. And they can change completely the terms of that contract that they promised to the government, and it will look nothing like what they actually said they're going to do. And the workers will be afraid to complain because they will be told they'll be blacklisted and there will be a stain on their visa and they'll never have the opportunity to come back again. So some of them suffer in silence, knowing that thinking they don't have any remedy until they encounter somebody like our agency or one of our migrant service providers in Michigan. So the people that come over on the H-2A visa like that, they won't have any familiarity with the town or the resources available or even how to ask for help unless we go to them, which is why our outreach to the migrant camps, which is twice weekly during the summer, is so important, because we can knock on doors and actually speak to the individuals that are here. And we can observe conditions about the way they live and the way their pay stubs look and how things are going with them. A lot of them might not even know the name of their employer. They might just know the name of their boss. And it's usually going to be a nickname. So we ask to see the pay stubs to see who the actual employer is. So in slide 12, I talk about that lack of geographical knowledge because as an instinct, as an attorney, or if you're a police officer or anybody and you're trying to get information, you want to know, what is your address? Well, these migrant housing sites don't necessarily have a specific address. I mean, we have to use a series of GPS coordinates and other things to find them. So they're usually hidden out in the back of an orchard or somewhere where they're not highly visible. And if there is an address, it will usually be to the farm employer and not to the actual migrant housing site. And they might tell you that they think they're near a city, but what we've found has been useful is they've been learning more and more about apps that are available and Waze and Google Maps. And so more frequently now they can drop me a pin to where they're located or to meet me somewhere off site if they don't want to be seen meeting with an advocate. And as long as there's internet in that area, we can find each other. So some of the next slide is slide 13, and it's the unfamiliarity with the legal protections. And a lot of the protections in Michigan have improved. In fact, the worker protection standard under the US EPA has improved, but workers might not know about it. Excuse me. And if they don't know about it, they can't advocate for themselves. So for example, there's new protections on restricted use pesticides, and there's new restrictions on how far the housing has to be located from where the pesticides are being applied. Because often I'll go visit a camp and it'll be too close to where the pesticides are being applied, and it's such a strong odor that I can't even stand to stand there and talk. It's that overpowering without a rag or something in front of my face. So there's protections that we're teaching the workers about. And then we also created an employer handbook to how to comply with the new and improved worker protection standards. We also know with these standards, we have a right to ask what pesticides are being used against them, and they can designate anybody to ask on their behalf, what chemicals am I working around? So on the next slide, we talked about the education level. Many of our farm workers never had a formal opportunity to be educated beyond the 6th grade. And so it's not unusual that I encounter somebody who is uncomfortable with reading or writing. And so we work around that. And we know that that's just something that might have to be dealt with. And we try to make our material, educational material, what I call low literacy, meaning you don't have to have a very advanced degree to understand things. So we like to use a lot of the iconography that helps explain things as well. In slide 16, we talked about the diseases and conditions, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. Very recently, we had a farm worker recently arrived to the country, and he was exposed to a restricted use pesticide, and he was made to work in very high heat. And he succumbed to what's called rhabdomyolysis, and his kidneys failed and they shut down. He ended up being put into kidney to transfusions. We were trying to get to him to help, and he was flown back to Mexico at 3 a.m., which seems to be a pattern with this particular farm employer, to fend for himself, where he would need dialysis for the rest of his life. Well, he ended up not being able to keep up with that in Mexico, and he ended up dying. And so we continued to work with his widow, and we started a new program for heat safety and pesticide poisoning to try to, this is completely preventable by the employer, and the workers can be more aware of it. So these are real tragedies that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is why our education is so important. And in cancer, we've detected, we've brought the mammogram machine, the big bus, right out to the migrant camps and had women register for their mammograms. And we've found areas of concern and actual cancers in about 10% of the people that we've been able to screen. So slide 17 talks about labor trafficking. And before I mentioned, there's an old school labor trafficking and a new school. So the old school was one where I worked with Homeland Security to rescue a group of workers who were trafficked by a group of individuals who brought them from knowing they were undocumented up to Michigan and held them captive and rationed their food, threatened them, assaulted them, and stole all their wages when they would get paid. So we worked for a long time to get them to trust us and work with us, and we were able to rescue them. And we got a 17-count indictment against 5 labor traffickers. But the modern way of labor trafficking is what I told you about with the H-2A contracts, where they promise pages and pages of terms and conditions, and when they get here, the workers it's a complete bait and switch. They're not being paid the hourly rate. They're working 100 to 117 hours a week with lanterns on their heads and light tractors, and they're being paid for 40 or 50 hours a week. That is considered by the US government and by the law to be fraud in foreign labor contracting, which is the equivalent of labor trafficking. So that's what I consider the new school labor trafficking. And we have a case filed regarding that as we speak with a pretty notorious farm employer in Oceania. And slide 18 is the case study of the old school labor trafficking. And that was a case where the traffickers put the workers in a trailer. Traffickers lived in the same trailer. And when the workers planned their escape, they had tied up some clothes in a plastic bag and hid it in the corner of the woods. They waited for the traffickers to fall asleep. They snuck out, and it was March in Michigan, and it started to snow. And they literally had to sneak back into the trailer to survive and risk being caught and killed because they were under threat of death by the traffickers. And it wasn't until we were able to intervene with the help of our immigration authorities that we were able to rescue them. Slide 19 is about child labor. And I'll just tell you this, the youngest clients that I represented for wage theft have been 4 and 6 years old. And we know from slide 20 that this came to light nationally through the Blueberry Children in the Fields story, which was a group of reporters came to Michigan from New York, came to our office and said, look, we want to expose child labor. And I said, well, this is a very hidden thing in Michigan, and it's not like I can take you to a child labor site. You would have to agree to embed with me for a whole summer, and I would show you the tricks of the trade to find where it's happening. And so, you know, I don't want to work with you unless you're able to do that. I thought they would never come back, but they talked to their producers, came back, and I showed them how to find child labor. They found it. There was a big expose. And that is what led to the birth of the Fair Food Program, which I'm really excited about. So if you look at slide 21, you can see that if you don't treat workers right and you end up having to get sued, it's going to get publicity all over the place. And a lot of growers don't want that. And retailers don't want to buy from farm employers who are exploiting workers. And so what we did was we worked to develop what we called the Fair Food Program. And it started actually with Meijer. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. Slide 22 just shows you the different photos of different housing and how they can go from good to bad to worse. And you'll see in one, there's a chicken coop in this picture, and I found a family living in the chicken coop, but you usually can see these barrack style houses. And what happens is there's infestations from bed bugs. It's a common problem, and farm employers don't want to take care of it the right way. It's got to have a heat treatment. So telltale sign for us is the purple cans of bug spray, but we also have infestations of rodents and other things. And I have been in housing there where my foot went through the floorboard because it was rotted, or I'm sitting at the table in the trailer with the family and the rain is coming in on us. So what happened one time is, starting in this Blueberry Children story, my attorney friend at Meijer said, we didn't know we were buying from this farm that got exposed for child labor. Could you give us a heads up when you know of something happening like this? Because we could do something about it. And I'm thinking, well, what could you do about it? And they said, well, we have agreements with our vendors that they need to follow the law, etc. And if they're not, we can address that with them. And so if you go to slide 23, this was the first example of how we use this with Meijer. We are allowed to have access as advocates to all of the migrant housing sites. Nobody can block us from that. And that's the critical key to protecting the farm workers. If we can't talk to them, we can't protect them. And there was a site where they weren't letting anybody in except through by armed guard. And so my option was my traditional legal remedy, where I run to court. I have to get a restraining order, or I have to ask for an emergency hearing. But because we had thought out this Fair Food Program with Meijer, who wanted to be on board, I called and said, we have this problem with this farm. And he said, I think we're buying from that farm. Let me call you back. It was 20 minutes later, he called me back and he said, we were buying from that farm. We talked to them and they took the armed guard down and said, you're free to enter. Now, they said it was something that they had done for good agricultural practices or for security. I don't care what the reason was. I didn't want our access blocked. And the solution was immediate. So I thought, here's a great program that is out of the court system that we were able to resolve for the workers. And the farm employer got the produce to market without any interruption and without a bunch of legal wrangling. So from there, I also worked with Spartan Nash to see, okay, so Meijer was on board and they've got over 200 stores. And so we send out courtesy alerts to our Fair Food members when we can verify what we believe to be a systemic problem ongoing. I don't send out a courtesy alert when one person, wasn't paid for 1 hour. This is more of a systemic overall issue. And these alerts don't happen frequently, but they're a really good market power tool. So if you look at slide 24, when I approached Spartan Nash about it, we talked about actually coming up with a pledge. And so we worked on specific terms of the pledge to say, like, we don't want to be a part of the exploitation. We want to be a part of the solution. And so we also wanted the pledge to not be legally binding on us if we needed to sue later, nor would it be legally binding on the store if they decided not to take action. But we wanted it to be a representation that they are supportive of eliminating exploitation in the food supply chain. And it has worked very well as a voluntary, immediate, real-time remedy. And Spartan Nash had all of their stores agree to take the pledge. And I have the part of the pledge on slide 24, and we can skip to slide 25 for the actual promises of the pledge. And you can see it's just to designate somebody to communicate with us so I can let you know when there's a systemic problem ongoing. And then and number 4, it's encourage the retailer to speak with their vendor to see if they can resolve the issue, or even if they're buying from that vendor. And then to just help us be a part of the solution by coming up with a remedy immediately before the season escapes us and before we need to escalate it into an actual lawsuit. So if you look at slide 26, I like to see the little dots on these because this is the Spartan Nash and the Meyer footprint. And I'm so proud of all these locations that support our work to eliminate exploitation in the food supply chain. But you see the bullet points of the stores next to these. Spartan Nash is a supplier of groceries to a number of independent stores, and they invited me to present about the Fair Food Program and how it can stop exploitation to a group in their corporate office. And so I went and did a presentation, and it was kind of dead after I gave the presentation. I didn't get good feedback, so I wasn't sure how it went. And I thought, well, maybe they are not aligned with this, or maybe these independent grocers don't really understand the pledge, or maybe I didn't present well. But shame on me, it turns out that every single one of them, all 81 locations, went back to their people and came back and said, we will sign this pledge. So it really made me feel supported, and to know that there are a number of businesses that do care and will take the pledge or otherwise support the Fair Food Program with a membership. And it really makes a difference in how many remedies I can offer for the client. And so the last slide is 27, and that is just, if you're interested in becoming a member, this is how you would become a member. And we have all of the retailers that I mentioned, and then we also have our first nonprofit member is the Kids Fair Food Basket, and our first restaurant is Amore Restaurant in Grand Rapids. And what I'm looking to do is approach big food buyers. And so I know that among the big food buyers are distributors and schools and hospitals. And so that's the goal of the expansion of the Fair Food Program. But any mom and pop is welcome to join, and the membership is very reasonable for them. And in turn, they get a Fair Food decal for their window, and then they can use our material to help promote their business and the passion of trying to eliminate exploitation in the food supply chain. So I know that I've taken up 30 minutes, and I don't want to cut into Ruben Martinez's time either. Bobby, do you want to take questions at the end for both of us, or?
Yes, we'll have time at the end of this webinar too for Q&A for all the attendees. So we'll just move on to the next presenter, and then if you have questions, you can throw it in the chat feature right now, or the Q&A feature in the Zoom. If you want to wait till the end of the webinar to do during the Q&A section, that we can take questions then as well. So thanks a lot, Teresa. It was very informational, and thank you so much for sharing with us today in regards to this wonderful program that we need in our area. So I'd like to now welcome our next speaker, Dr. Ruben Martinez. Dr. Martinez is a professor at Emeritus of Sociology and a former director at the Julian Samora Research Institute at Michigan State University. His scholarly interests include Latino community issues, diversity leadership, education and ethno-racial minorities, youth development, Latino labor and entrepreneurship, environmental justice, and institutional and societal change. Dr. Ruben, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Bobby, and good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here to share my own knowledge with you. And I appreciate all of the dimensions of the issues that Teresa has brought forward. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to be talking mainly about the conditions of farm worker employment. Basically, we've known, those of us who have done work in this arena, that farm workers are essential workers. They were not highlighted as essential workers until the pandemic came upon us, and it made it very clear. And basically, the essential workers were those who were mandated to go to work, to continue to work during the pandemic, so that the infrastructure of our nation would not collapse. And no one can argue that our food systems are part of that food structure and that they had to keep going. So our farm workers they were required to go to work. They had to keep the food systems functioning. And, there had to be certain steps taken to maintain their health in terms of the relative to the pandemic. But it's important that we recognize that they fill critical jobs in our society, but that they're located at the bottom of the agricultural system in the food pyramid. They're at the point of production. They are working to tend to the crops. They harvest the crops. As Teresa mentioned, they're now basically involved in harvesting fruits and vegetables, specialty crops. They do work in nurseries and so on. Whereas in the past, they used to, when Michigan had a lot of sugar beets, they used to really come to the state to work the sugar beet industry. Migrant and seasonal workers are, we don't always know what we're talking about when we say these things. So it's important, I think, to go over the ideas. Migrants are the ones that are moving from one state to another in search of jobs. And here in Michigan, what we have are two major migrant streams that supply the farm workers to this state. One that comes from Texas, that's the older one. It's been happening since, I would say that since the 20s, and it's part of the Midwest stream. And then we also have the Florida group that come up annually, and they're part of the Eastern stream. And then we have the Western one, but the Western one is over, feeding the labor needs of California, Oregon, Washington, and so on. But these are the two principal ones that are sending farm workers, migrant farm workers to Michigan. They stay they arrive sometime around April, and many of them stay till about October, and then they head back. On average, they tend to work about 39 weeks a year. The seasonal farm workers don't migrate. Some of them have settled out of the migrant stream, live in some of these rural communities where they are familiar with the people. And instead of migrating, they work, during the seasons when this agricultural season is employing them. That's when they work, and then they try to find and perform work during the rest of the year in other areas. Sometimes they get out of the agricultural work and move to full-time employment in other industries, but some of them stay in full-time employment in that particular industry as well. When we talk about the demographics of the farm workers, this is one of the probably the bane of the demographer's existence, and that is how can we count them all, given all the different sources of farm workers and so forth. So there's principally two different types of calculations. One is based on estimates of workers using surveys. So the most comprehensive one is the one done within the Department of Labor, and that's the National Agricultural Worker Survey. And what this does, it focuses on the supply side of the labor market. That is, how many workers are there out there? And some of you might already be familiar with the fact that right now we're experiencing a farm worker shortage across the entire nation. The other approach is to do estimates of farm workers by looking at the number of jobs in the agricultural industry, and then kind of estimating how many workers would be needed. These are specialized studies, and here in Michigan we have the what we call the IMSC committee. It's the Interagency Migrant Services Committee, which has been in existence for a long time. They try to address many of the needs of the farm workers and to make sure that they're treated well and so on. But the last enumeration study that they contracted was, I think, in 2013. And so let's see what they found. What are the social characteristics? Who are these workers? Even though we know that they have changed over the decades. We had a lot of, in the early part of the 20th century, it was a lot of Eastern European workers, African Americans and others, and it has shifted over time, as one would expect. So basically across the nation, we have approximately, on average, 1.5 million farm workers annually, with 2.5 million employed for wages during a typical year. So we're talking here basically temporary workers. The NAS survey is an actual survey of farm workers themselves. So the latest report surveyed farm workers from October of 2018 to September of 2020. What they found, they had a random sample of 2,172 farm workers, found that 63% were born in Mexico. So unlike, the first part of the 20th century, when we were getting the Eastern Europeans and African Americans and so on, we're now getting them from south of the border, if you will. 63% born in Mexico, 5% from Central America, and 30% from other regions and countries, mostly from here in the United States, as 30% of them are actually U.S. born. And of these, the ones that are U.S. born, 32% are Hispanic. Overall, 72% of our farm workers are Hispanic, and then 28% are from other ethnic backgrounds. The New American Economy Fund, which hires Philip Martin, who is an agricultural economist retired now from the University of California, Davis, does a lot of work in this arena. And he estimated in 2019 that there were approximately 36.4% of our farm workers who were undocumented. So not only does this increase their vulnerability, because they're frequently told by unscrupulous employers that they're going to call the ICE on them or have them deported or something like that. So it's leveraging power over them and leading to exploitation. The last enumeration study that I was mentioning by the IMSC was a decade ago. Actually, it came out, I think, in 2013. Set the figures here in Michigan at 49,135. Again, this one was done by looking at the number of jobs and the number of employees that would be needed, and accompanied by 42,729 children for a total of 94,167. IMSC has been trying to get another study done, and I hope that they'll be able to get that done soon. Another source of information is the National Center for Farm Worker Health, also known as the NCFH, which set the 2017 figures as follows: 86,296 farm workers. Remember, we're talking Michigan here. 11,007 dependents, and something like 12,351 H-2A workers back in 2021. These numbers are increasing rapidly. There has been a rapid turn by farmers here in Michigan and really across the nation to hire H-2A workers. And part of that is because of the farm worker shortage that is taking place. The New American Economy Fund estimates that the percentage of foreign-born is at 30%, and the percent of undocumented is at 17% in 2021. So the figures are a little bit different, but they're generally in the ballpark. And in 2021, NCFH estimated that there were over 70,000 jobs monthly from July through September here in Michigan. So what do we have when I say that I'm going to talk about employment issues? Well, Dennis has already identified many of them, but we need to also think of this as dangerous work. We know that farm work is one of the more dangerous occupations, but with regard to the farm workers, heat stroke is a major one. There's, of course, also pesticide exposure, which leads to cancer, can lead to infertility and other reproductive problems, neurological disorders and respiratory conditions, and lots of different skin conditions. And then, of course, there are farm accidents. We hear every year of someone who has died or been killed through a farm accident. 45% of the NOS sample indicated that they were covered by unemployment compensation. So that leaves 55% of them who are not. They're not covered by it. The percent of patients at migrant health centers with income levels below the 100% of the federal poverty level by migrant streams is as follows. The Western has 73% are below the 100%, federal poverty level. Midwest has 76%, and the Eastern is at 85%. These were, remember, just the patients that were in migrant health centers. Migrant health centers are throughout the country, and they are funded by the federal government to provide healthcare to the farm workers, but sometimes they're situated in places where they're not easily accessible, unfortunately, or they're not very well staffed, and all of the sort of issues that arise. Teresa has already identified wage theft. Every season, we learn of it. It happened again and again. We must keep in mind that crime is always part of society. The only difference is that whether it goes up or whether it goes down. What we're trying to do is make sure that it's at the lowest level possible when it comes to farm workers. That's what we want. And of course, given human nature, someone will always try to take up advantage or take advantage of the vulnerable and powerless workers that we find here among the farm workers. They don't get any overtime pay. They work, Teresa mentioned that they work, close to 100 hours a week. They work a heck of a lot more than 40 hours a week. They're not covered by the National Labor Relations Act, so they don't have the support, if you will, to be able to unionize. The only ones unionized and get that support is over in California, as you know, through the work of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers Union. Housing, constantly substandard and overcrowded, lots of sanitation problems. I'm glad that Teresa gave you a little bit more detail on these. And then there's if you really wanted to see what it looks like, and it was looking like 13 years ago, knowing that it hasn't changed considerably, is the Michigan Civil Rights Commission did a report back in 2010 and documented the bad housing. So you can take a look at that. There's also, concern about health, limited access to health care. Yes, these migrant health centers are out there, but as you can expect, they're not a priority and they're not well funded. There are diseases, diabetes, skin cancer, musculoskeletal injuries from repeated stooping, lifting, and cutting, and so on. Lots of those problems we find. And of course, sexual violence. Sexual violence by the contractors, sexual violence by other members of the farm worker community and so forth. And I was just looking the other day at a film that highlights and tries to expose sexual violence among these labor segments. It's titled Breaking the Silence. And I hope that some of you, and it's a very short film, and I hope some of you will take time to find it on YouTube and take a look at it and get a sense of how it works. And then, of course, there's human trafficking. Teresa also spoke to this. This is, something that occurs frequently, or more commonly, I should say, among the contractors. These are those third-party entities who are recruiting the workers, bringing them up, and then they lease them out, if you will, to the farms and move them around and so forth. And it is an opportunity for them to be able to engage in human trafficking. What they do is they take away the visas, they hold them, and so they put the workers in a very vulnerable position. And of course, child labor, which continues to go. We do have laws here in Michigan regarding child labor, under 18 years of age and under 16 years of age and so on. But this really increased during the pandemic. And if you think about it, it would have increased because where were they going to send their kids? Right, everything was sort of changed for them, and so they had to take their children to the fields with them, and so we found that a lot of them were in the fields during the pandemic. So when we talk about the status of farm workers, it's generally the same across the country. Michigan is not much different. Poverty is one of the main characteristics. They receive low wages, although right now, in this historical moment, it's improving somewhat, due to labor shortages because the farmers have to compete to try to get these workers to come to their farms. So we don't know how long that's going to last. There's, of course, all the health issues that we've talked about, and of course, higher mortality rates. That, as I mentioned, one who became ill and went to Mexico and died over there. There are employment issues, and we need to think of this not only in terms of labor rights, but in terms of human rights. That, this population needs to have safe working conditions, and they need to have their civil rights and human rights respected. And these are also issues of justice. The education of youth, low achievement. It's not just the parents who have low achievement of education. It's also the youth, because there's all these gaps across the states. With if the kids come up from Texas and then they take some courses here, need to make sure that when they return to Texas, that they get credit for the work they did up here and so forth. And although we've tried to work on that, and it seems like we never can really fix that for whatever reason. And then there's the general view that we must come to grips with, and this is the most vulnerable and powerless segment of our labor force here in the United States and globally, really. And in fact, back in 1970, there was a hearing on migrant and seasonal farm worker powerlessness. That was the actual title of the hearing, and you can see it online. It was conducted by the Committee on Labor and Public Welfare with the in the 91st Congress with the U.S. Senate. And also keep in mind that one of the factors that makes this population really vulnerable, beyond some of the things that we talked about, is their invisibility. Not only do people generally not understand that, as Teresa mentioned, that most of the fruits and vegetables that we find in the stores have been touched, have been picked, have been tended to by farm workers, but it's not part of our consciousness. And secondly, the places where their housing sites are located is that they're out of sight on the farms, in the back fields or in the back sectors of the farm and so on. And so they're very invisible to the rest of us. And people don't think about them, and that makes them even just as vulnerable because of being invisible. So there's also what I would say is a lack of high-profile public advocacy. I think that Teresa and her team are doing really great work in bringing that to light. So the result is what? That many of these workers, not all of them, of course, not all growers are bad growers, but there is a great amount of exploitation that goes out there, and many of them lead lives of exploitation. So I'm very supportive of the Fair Food Program. Quoting from their materials, food from a supply chain devoid of worker exploitation. And we as consumers need to pay attention to this, because we're part of this whole food system, right? Where we buy, what we buy, and so forth, either sustains or has an influence on the supply chain. We have to consider that we are part of that market power that can help resolve labor issues by harnessing the power of the businesses. That is us working very hard on the businesses, but we also need to familiarize consumers to work with the businesses and make their purchases with those who have pledged to be able to work only with those vendors who are following the law, particularly with regard to our farm workers. So it's important to supply fair food and purchase fair food. So this will help, induce those farms who are not treating their workers well, not treating them ethically, not treating them humanely, to do so without exploitation, because their economic survivability depends on it. And if we can make it more of a public issue and involve consumers and make sure that businesses are supporting the Fair Food Program, I think the workers will have another source of support that hasn't been there for them before. So with that, I want to say thank you and for listening, and happy to answer any questions when they come up.
So thank you, Dr. Rubin and Teresa, for sharing your amazing experiences and sharing your knowledge in regards to this wonderful program that we have here in Michigan that we're working on. So now I'd like to open up for questions. We have a few questions in the Q&A chat that I see that would like to be answered. So if you guys see if you all can maybe give a brief statement. We're a little limited on time, so brief answer in regards to some of these questions. So first question we have is a fair food program for smaller farmers selling at Michigan farmers markets?
Yes, so we encourage any size farm to join the Fair Food Program. And what that means is when we're the boots on the ground and we see something happening and we believe there's it's a systemic problem, and that we've been able to verify it as best as we can, we send a courtesy alert, and it lets the farms know that something's happening that they might not know about, or that they might know about but be overlooking, and then they can take the appropriate action. And at the farmers markets, a lot of our board members and our members will ask growers at the farm markets, are you a member of the Fair Food Program? And that's really how they learn about it for the first time.
Perfect. Another question we have here is what percentage of migrant workers do you feel are being exploited, and what percent of farm owner employers are exploiting migrant farm workers?
It's hard to say, but I would say, I don't know, 75% of farm employers never come to my attention. So I would say the rest of them, the 25%, keep us busy full time. Not only us, but some other agencies. So.
And I would add that this is a moving target, because, the players are different, the contractors are different, the context is changing, and so on. So, and because it's invisible, and a lot of it never gets to Teresa's team. It's just out there, it just exists, and it goes unknown to everyone. But I would say that probably 75% is a good estimate.
Okay. All right. Can you share how you are collaborating with the Michigan Public Health Departments?
Yeah, so we worked really closely with, and we still do work with the Michigan Health Departments, and especially during COVID, we came up with material. There were some cultural barriers to workers wanting to get vaccinated and understanding, and some religious objections to that, and then getting them registered for pop-up clinics. And so we did a tremendous amount of work dispelling myths for our client population, and then working with clinics that service migrant areas to assist with registering folks and encouraging them to learn about vaccinations and the benefits of them, and then supporting them at the clinics. And also I did a state of the state basically address with public health departments to let them know during the pandemic what was really happening, because the state had an idea of sending COVID positive people to a colony, isolated colony in remote Michigan, and that just wasn't going to work and wasn't working at all. And so we had to do some education immediately in the process about what we were seeing and why people weren't seeking out that and avoiding trying to be sent to an isolation center, especially when they didn't want to be separated from families, and when it would have been easier and cheaper to just put them up in a hotel room somewhere. But we continue to work closely with public health departments on these emerging issues. And one of them that we're paying more attention to now is the heat stroke and heat illness issues. Because, we're losing every year, somebody dies of it. And this year it happened in Michigan, and it could have been completely prevented.
So that would probably, unfortunately, that has to be our last question, and we're a little short on time. But for all the other questions that were delivered in the chat, we will be responding with those as well. I'll be sending them out to Teresa and Dr. Rubin as well, and if they want to answer them or we want to answer, when they answer them, we'll make sure we answer and send it to the right party as well. I want to thank everyone for attending today. If you found this talk to be very valuable today, please consider becoming a member of our Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and checking out our website for upcoming webinars and other opportunities as well. We will be having a large majority of these conversations and webinars and trainings as part of and we will be starting up an equity and sustainability working group as well. Colleague Kara just shared our website in the chat. So like I said, make sure you continue to check that for other opportunities and webinars similar to this. And thank you so much for joining us today. We will also be sending out a recording of this webinar for individuals as well, and emails for follow-up if you want to. So once again, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Teresa, Dr. Rubin, and the MI and the Michigan State Business Forum staff as well. And you all can have a good rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.